Today, I'm going to talk to you about session prep for your tabletop role playing games and why we even bother to do it. Hi, everyone. I'm Gary. Welcome back. We are going to talk about prep today and how we sort of prepare for our games, like session wise and like campaign wise, and what we can expect from our game master when we come to the table and kind of sit down to play something like D&D. So quickly, like, why do we even bother prepping our games? What I mean by prep is the game master doing things between the sessions to make sure that the game moves smoothly, is basically what preparation is. So it's coming up with NPCs, coming up with bits of backstory, reading the adventure if it's a published module, or designing bits of their world. So why do we even bother doing it? Well, I think there's basically three reasons. And they play on kind of like different elements of game mastering. So first of all, mastery or kind of confidence. We want as game masters to feel a sense that we are the game master. So we want to feel like we are the master of the setting and the narrative and of the table while playing. And preparing for it allows us a kind of bit of security because we have a sense of where things are going. One thing that I always say to my players at the end of every session is, especially if you've got like multiple hooks and they're like following different things, what do you intend to do next session? And that just means that I can make sure that my prep is kind of tailored to that and it's really meaningful. And then when I come to the game, I'm like, okay, we're doing this. And I can point the camera at that kind of immediate decision or that immediate like kind of like location or whatever it is, like moment, scene, and we can just kind of get going. So that's the first reason, mastery or confidence. Secondly, I think enjoyment. Yeah, I think most people who are game masters, if you're a forever GM like me, and that's okay. I think it's a good thing to be, I think it's perfectly fine to be a forever GM. I never see that as a bad thing. I think it's enjoyable to prepare for a game. I think it's interesting. Quite often when I'm preparing for a game, one of the things I do is I'll just go for a walk, put a podcast in and just kind of think about or some music on, just think about what I want to happen or what I think might happen and how I can kind of prepare my kind of like table and my preparation, for that. The last thing is obviously necessity. You have to do some prep, and to some extent, you can't negotiate with it. There are games that you can prep less, and there are scenarios within different games that you can prep less. And there are kind of play cultures and tables that you could actually, like groups of people that you could prepare less for. But ultimately, you're going to have to do some of it, right? It's a necessity, and I think that it's part of the responsibility as well as the privilege of being a game master is that you get to spend time outside of the game, sort of still playing the game, at least thinking about it quite intensely. So that's one of the reasons. You would expect your players when they turn up, unless they're like really new, you would expect them to kind of basically know the rules. And I think that you need to basically know what the content for the session is going to be in general terms, unless they do something really kind of like left field. It's part of the social contract is that if you're going to be running the game, that you at least have some sense of what's going to happen in a particular session. So one thing that I see quite often posted online is like, how long do you prep for? Like, or better, like how much prep do you need to do? Like how many sessions ahead do you need to prep? And I always think that they're kind of questions that are somewhat indicative of someone who just hasn't done this very much when you hear that question, because the real answer is so dependent on like it's such kind of like a multifaceted problem that how much prep do you need to do? Well, it depends where in the campaign they are, what game you're playing, if it's homebrew or if it's pre-written, or how many players you've got, or what the expectations of the campaign are, or is it, there's so much going on that actually there isn't really a correct answer for that. It's also worth saying that if you're like me, and basically the demographics suggest that you are, like I can see the demographics of people who watch me, that you're of an age where you probably have a job, and a decade and a half ago when I was at university, I would have had loads of time to prep my games, and I would have therefore done more prep. And now I'm always in a situation where, despite the fact that I'm running 3 games, and this is my primary hobby, is role-playing and wargaming, I basically feel like I never have enough time to prep for my games. And then it's like, okay, so if I don't actually have enough time to prep to the level that I would like ideally want, because I never am going to, like at this point in my life, I'm just not, what can I do that makes sure the time that I do have is really meaningful and really useful? So what I'd like to do is I'd like to just lay out a kind of basic taxonomy of like 3 types of prep that I just think that it's really worth defining as we go through this, and then we can talk about what is like really useful and what is less useful, and what is really necessary and what is like less necessary. And we're going to start with the most specific examples, and then we are going to move to the more abstract forms of preparation that I think to some extent you need to kind of engage with all three. So firstly, the primary, I would say the most necessary type of session prep is what I would call just that, session prep, preparing what is specifically going to occur in the session, in the upcoming sessions. And I don't mean rail running, I don't mean planning what's going to happen. I just mean, okay, right, they're going along this road. All right, I'm going to need some road encounters, right? And thinking about, okay, so if they get attacked by Peritons here on this cliffside, is there something interesting that I can do with kind of like the setup, like, okay, so it's going to be on a cliff. Can I add some like high winds to make the kind of the combat more varied and interesting? Is they're kind of like struggling to not get blown off while also kind of like fighting these like monsters that are flapping down at them? So that's session prep, right? It's thinking about what are these specific characters going to do in the next session, not any further than just in the next session. And what do I need to know? And it's also things like, actually reading the adventure that you intend to run. So not reading like setting guides, but being like, okay, I am going to be running the Temple of Elemental Evil. The characters are heading towards the Earth Temple, which is the first level. So I should probably reread the first level of the temple, right? And then I know that if they go this way, there's black bugbears in this room. If they go this way, there's skeletons in this room. And that is really, really helpful for kind of keeping a track of everything. It also gives you the opportunity to just kind of sit back for a second and think about how you are going to structure the actual play at the table in terms of when are you going to start. I would like to do a video, like really detailed talk through of how I do session prep at some point, because I think that this is one of the things that takes up the most amount of time percentage-wise in terms of the prep that we do, but is actually probably undervalued by newer game masters who often get mired, I think, in the next type of preparation. So the second type of preparation is what I call campaign building or setting building. So this is more abstract and it has less value to you at the table, or less, no, that's not true. It has less immediate value to you at the table. And this is things like designing cities, coming up with histories, creating maps. And this is kind of the usefulness of this is very varied in the sense that you might, if you create a map of a city that they may or may not go to, well, if they go to it, it'll be really useful. And then if they don't go to it, it would have been kind of pointless. At least pointless in terms of like the setting prep. Now, I often think newer game masters, they really get hung up on this sort of thing because it's really fun, right? Creating like fantasy universes, like secular fantasies is really, really exciting and interesting. And, come up with histories and different guilds and like different like countries and like the king is like, like a demon in disguise, all the kind of stuff that is almost certainly not going to play out in the game or not even going to be relevant in the game. That can be really fun. Having said that, in doing this, you do a couple of things. You start to preload a bit of content into the campaign so that you can use it later. So just put on the screen now, this is a map that I'm now in my early 30s. This is a map I drew of a section of my campaign setting, my homebrew world, in about maybe when I was in my like later teens. And I know that this region, which I call the Free Cities, a lot of my groups are very familiar with this map. They know that when we play it, it's going to be kind of taking place in this. And I keep bringing this map out. Like I bring this map out probably every session, nearly. And therefore, that was a really high value to me to do this campaign preparation, right? It wasn't preparation for any specific scenario or any specific adventure or any specific session. So it's not session prep, it's just campaign prep. But actually, it's had a really kind of like long tail in terms of its value to me as a game master. And the flip side example of this would be if you are running something like Woofrup, like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Okay, do I need to kind of just really get a handle on the entire campaign is going to be set in like Stirland, which is a province in the Empire, and it's a published setting. Do I need to really kind of get a handle on what the customs of Stirland are? Okay, that might be really helpful, but it might not be if the characters don't actually spend that much time interacting with people. If it's like more of a dungeon crawly kind of like scenario. Same for if I'm going to run, the Great Dragonlance campaign, which we've done before. Okay, so it starts on the continent of, I think it's Ansalon or Abernathy. I always get the two mixed up. Okay, do I need to know what the cultural histories of this place are? So then, depending on where they go, I do have a sense of what kind of ruins they may encounter randomly, what kind of peoples they may encounter randomly. So campaign preparation, I think, is really fun. I think it can border on self-indulgence a little bit if you are like me and you're a little bit older and you are prepping for your games. And basically, you have to do the session prep before you do the campaign prep. And sometimes it can be difficult to pry ourselves away from it, because if you don't have that much time, I actually think campaign building, world building is actually far more interesting, or just it's just more, more enjoyable many times than building sessions. And partly that is because sessions are kind of like, session prep is like fire and forget. Like, you're going to use these encounters like once, or if they don't get used, you might use them again in future. But for the most part, you're just going to use them once. And that is not the case with campaign prep, right? You get to kind of inflict, I suppose, your setting, your homebrew world, or your kind of like censor of a particular published setting on the players. And that can be really fun and really enjoyable, and done in a way that everyone really engages with and is really interesting. But it is not as necessary as session prep. And then lastly, I would say that the final type of preparation that you do is what I call procedure building or system building. And this is where you come up with methods for creating content on the fly. And this is quite specific. It's the most abstract. No, that doesn't make sense. This is specific in terms of what I'm going to talk about, but it's the most abstract in terms of its kind of like usefulness to a specific session. And what procedure building is coming up with things like random encounter tables for different regions in your world or in your campaign setting. And that is really useful. But the problem is that, but with procedure building, is that it takes quite a long time. Like, it's very time and labor intensive to be like, okay, I'm going to come up with a random encounter table. Okay, so how many events or how many monsters do I want on the random encounter table? Okay, I want 50. I want it to be like really varied. And it's like, okay, well, now I've actually got to come up with 50 different encounters, and, work out if I want them all to come up on the same percentage chance and things like that. But having said that, it is something that once you have built it, unless it is like, for example, to use the example of a random encounter table, unless it's a random encounter table for like a specific dungeon that they're only going to go to once, or a specific like slot of time within the campaign, right, when everything's kind of going awry in the campaign world, unless it's one of those things, you are going to get loads and loads of use out of it over the years. Because when they travel, you can be like, okay, I'm going to run around an encounter. And then it's like, okay, well, the party comes across like 16 elephants, and I wasn't expecting that to happen here. And how do I kind of integrate this? And that can be really fun to use as prompts, right? I think that procedural content is really engaging. I've talked a lot about my love of the Stygian Library and The Gardens of Yin by Emmett Allen. Because that is an adventure that is just like procedural, right? And it doesn't just have to be encounter tables. It can be kind of, things like treasure tables, anything that allows you to, prompts you to consider new content that you hadn't prepared specifically in your session prep there and then, can be really helpful. This can even be done as part of like monster behaviors, which I think is really interesting. So if your party are going to face a beholder, you could have a kind of like a table that you roll each round, like a really kind of simplified table. It doesn't have really complex, that tells you what a beholder will do round to round, because it's kind of already on there, right? You roll to see which like eye ability it uses. Well, how about you roll to see whether it flees, or it moves to a distance where it can hit them with a very particular ray the next round, right? Things like that, like AI sort of like system building, can be very, very interesting. And all of that is about, I suppose, taking some of the kind of cognitive load off of the game master during the game, despite the fact that if it's done poorly, system building or procedure building, it can feel, what you don't want is, because it can feel like nothing has any kind of like particular connection or interaction. So it's still got to be tied to the setting or tied to the narrative in some way. And it might not come up every single session, and in fact probably will not, and it's a lot of effort to get it to when it does, when it will come up, but it is incredibly useful, and it is basically always going to be useful to you. So, and I think another good example of something like that would be getting lists of random names as well. That'd be a really, really good example. So when the player character's walking to town, they go, "What the barkeep called?" And you're like, "Oh God, I don't know," and I don't want to say Bob or Jeff again, so I'm just gonna kind of like flip to the back of my notebook and go, "Okay, I've got my like 100 like dwarf names. All right, his name's like Gunter," and just cross it off. I think that can be really helpful as well. But again, I suppose that would make it single use. So one thing that I'd like to do in future is I would like to talk about what preparation like looks like for session preps, like how I would go about structuring a session to make sure that, depending on how much time you've got and how many players you've got, you get the maximum amount of enjoyment and engagement out of your prep without spending like hours and hours and hours without spending more time preparing than you do playing, because I think that is ultimately like not a good thing. I think you should be spending less time preparing than you do playing. I think because you're not probably, if you're like me, you're probably not going to have that amount of time to do that forever or for every session. And therefore, you want to come up with systems to help you prepare and help you kind of like game master on the fly. But I'm really interested to know what you think of those three breakdowns. Comment below. As ever, thank you for taking the time to listen to this. I'm Gary, and I'll speak with you again soon.